I'm really excited to welcome two people who are fantastic community organizers, fantastic people within our communities. So the first person is Lyndon George, who's a member of Chippewas of Kettle and Stony Point First Nations, who I have had the great pleasure to see in community as well as in programs and services. They are auntie and uncle to 117 nieces and nephews, and just so many people as well in our community. Making those connections, making that space, and also being there on protest spaces, deconstructing those hierarchies in our communities in such a caring way. And our second speaker is Michael Blashko, who is a bisexual Métis man who grew up in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and completed a French immersion primary and secondary education prior to going to the University of Winnipeg. In July 2020, he made the move to Hamilton, Ontario, where he started his current position within the Hamilton Community Legal Clinic. And he's now a member of the Hamilton Community Legal Clinic's housing lawyers and our lead of the Queer Justice Project. So I'm so excited to have both of you here.
And thank you for that introduction, Courtney. As was mentioned, my name is Michael, and we also have Lyndon George, who is here with me today.
Bonjour, Nishna, Nawakagiji Migwan Dishnakars is my name. Lyndon George is my colonizer's name. And I'll talk a little bit more about myself after Michael's done yammering on here in a few minutes.
So welcome, everyone. Essentially today we're going to be covering, a very vast topic. And, we normally do this kind of training in about 5 to 6 hours. Today we have 2, generally a much broader and deeper kind of training session. So we certainly encourage people, if you're interested in what you hear today, to contact us. We do provide these trainings, the more in-depth ones as well, to different organizations, communities, partners, anyone who kind of really requests it. It is a bit of a time commitment for sure, but we do, enjoy doing the fuller session, but we're gonna, do our best here today to cover as much as possible. We will be throwing a lot of information here at people. Some of it might be pretty new, some might be, familiar, and, there's a lot to know, and it's a lot that will also evolve over time. So this is a kind of a growing area. There's always new terms, new language being developed. So it's not a stagnant topic either. So maybe if you hear this training from us again in a year from now, there might be some changes as well. So always something to keep in mind. I just want to go over some of the, goals and expectations here. Generally, it is okay and even expected today that if you feel uncomfortable at any point, that's okay. These aren't easy topics, but we do encourage everyone that, when you maybe feel that discomfort, to really kind of think about why that is and also kind of where it's coming from. Normally, when we're doing this, we heavily encourage questions and participation as much as possible. But we are again trying to cover a lot in a short time today. So we'll do our best to answer some questions if they come up. You can enter them in the chat or raise your hand, and we can try and get some of those covered as well. I don't know how much time or if any we'll have at the end. But we are planning to put our emails in the chat, likely at the end, for anyone who's interested, who can contact us if there's any follow-up questions as well. We do just want to provide generally a bit of a disclaimer. So we provide this presentation, Nawakagiji Migwan and myself, provide it from our own work and experience and our own identities. So we have very specific identities. And so when we are addressing topics that relate to identities that we don't share, we don't necessarily consider ourselves experts on that. It's very much those who have the lived experience with those identities who are the experts on that topic. So there may be basically an unlimited amount of possible intersecting identities. For the queer community members, it makes it like each person's perspective and experience is unique. In this role over the last year and a half or so, I've really kind of learned and really grown to appreciate kind of how much queerness spans all of human experience. And it's really part of what, really makes it really amazing and beautiful. So these are our goals generally through this training that we do to raise awareness about the diversity of gender expression, gender identity, and sexual orientation that exists with the Two-Spirit and LGBTQIA, PGNC community. And we'll get into that acronym, but to challenge, heteronormativity, cisnormativity, the invisibility that kind of marginalizes members of these communities. That kind of introduction, I'll pass it over to Nawakagiji Migwan.
Bonjour, Nishna, Nawakagiji Migwan Dishnakars, as I've already introduced myself. I am Anishinaabe Ojokwe. Anishinaabe, Ojokwe, those are the terms from the Anishinaabe nation that help describe my roles and responsibilities as Indigenous queer. I am a auntie uncle of 118 nieces and nephews. That includes nieces, nephews, and great nieces and nephews, and great great nieces and nephews. I am a first generation survivor of residential school. My mother was a survivor. I am a survivor of Federal Indian Day School. My mother comes from Aamjiwnaang, the Chippewas Sarnia First Nation. My father comes from Ajudenaa, the Stony Point First Nation. I am family member to Dudley George of the Ipperwash Crisis. I am the Indigenous Justice Coordinator for the Hamilton Community Legal Clinic, and I work with several different community legal clinics in the Golden Horse area, as well as across Ontario, assisting our Indigenous brothers and sisters, our relatives, actually, in accessing the legal assistance that they need in whatever area of law that they require. I first want to acknowledge why we are even here today. I would like to acknowledge all of our sisters and our trans and trans identifying, all of the women, girls, trans identifying, and two-spirit people who have started their journey much too soon. And for those who are still missing and have not been brought home to their loved ones. 15 to 20 years ago, we would not have been afforded this space to be able to have these conversations publicly, but they were conversations that we were already having at our kitchen and dining room tables and around our fires. And then to acknowledge all of the participants here today, because in my mind, if you're here joining us today, it's because you're doing magnificent work out there for all of our ancestors. And for that, I say thank you. To all the incredible panel speakers, 15 to 20 years ago, we would have never seen such a large panel with all Indigenous or almost all Indigenous people who are speaking and sharing our wisdom and knowledge and expertise. And for that, I am very thankful. And to all of the organizers who have taken the time to make sure that they bring us together in a good way and providing us with safer space to be able to talk about these things. In order to understand where we've come from and where we are, is Indigenous queer two-spirit people in this world and in our communities, we have to be able to reflect on the influences that history has had on us as Indigenous people here on Turtle Island. And so if we could stop for a second to think about the clan system and where we have come from in our communities, where the clan systems, our systems of governance have been in our community many, many years ago, and where they exist today in our communities. When we think that the clan system was a very strong system of governance for many Indigenous groups, we know that today in 2022, we have many Indigenous communities who are not employing the clan system in governance, that we have been oppressed and our communities assimilated and forced by acts of genocide to be able to talk about our traditional forms of governance. And the traditional forms of governance included everybody. Everybody had a role and everybody had a responsibility. So I think that we can agree that the clan system is one system that had been influenced by settlers and by colonialism, and that in many Indigenous communities are not employed. In my community, I would dare say that 50% of our people perhaps may not know what a clan system is and may not know their clan. And because of that, we do not have a functioning clan governance system. So when we think about how oppression, how genocide has influenced levels of government and systems of government within Indigenous communities, we have to then reflect on what else has it influenced. So let's take a second just to reflect on what else has changed within our communities. Well, we know that spirituality and religion has changed. We know that clothing has changed, housing, health, all of these things that we do every day have changed for us Indigenous people. Some of the strong influences that colonialism has had on Indigenous people are our constructs of family and our constructs of gender and gender identity. So in order to understand the influences and how it has changed our inclusive history that includes Two-Spirit Indigenous queer people, we have to understand where those influences come from. This is Queen Elizabeth. And Queen Elizabeth was known as the Virgin Queen in England. And at the time that Elizabeth I was ruling England, this was in and about the time that settlers, people were starting to come over and looking for new land and resources. And in England, we have to understand what was happening over there. So all of Europe was enraged in war. And much of that war was a product of spiritual beliefs. Everybody was fighting for resources and land. People did not like Elizabeth I. She was often referred to as the Virgin Queen, and they did not like her. Spain certainly did not like her ruling because she was a Protestant queen. She was not married. So they were fighting and they were doing all this stuff, killing each other over there across the creek. And they were doing it with the support of not only their governance systems, but also with the church. Spain and England and France, they were all enraged, fighting each other. And finally in Spain, everybody should have heard about this guy through school. This is Shakespeare. This is also the era of Shakespeare. And Shakespeare is well known for a lot of his sonnets and different poetry that he has brought. But in this time period, it is well known that women had no role in Europe and in other spaces at this time, unless you were born privileged, such as Elizabeth was, or Mary Queen of Scots was. So women often had no role and had no voice in the communities across the Big Creek. And in Shakespearean time, a woman who wanted to be an actor could not be. And rather than having women on the stage, they employed the services of very young men whose voices had not yet changed, and they played the roles of women on stage. Any woman who dared step on stage was often called or labeled a whore and was taken out to the middle of a village and was bound in the middle of the village, and piles of rocks set around her, and the community was encouraged to stone her to death because women could not have a voice. This is also the time when witches were very prominent. And any woman who had a strong voice or had a very strong opinion or seemed to have a very strong personality with a sense of direction and self-confidence would often be labeled a witch. And the same demise would happen. She would be dragged out to the middle of a village and stones were put around her, and the community was encouraged to stone her to death, or she was set on a pyre and bound there, and the community would come together and burn the witches. So this is some of the stuff that was going on over across the creek. This is one of the very first sketches that we have of an interaction of Spain with Indigenous people. So in this picture, what has happened at this point, and we're looking at around 1592, 1594, when the Spanish explorer by the name of Balboa was out driving around in his big wooden ship over all the big water basins, and he landed up over here at the southern tip of Turtle Island, got off his big ship, stepped on land, and noticed that there were people here. And so Balboa hopped onto his big ship, went across the Big Creek again, and went to his leadership in Spain and said to the leadership in Spain that we found you some new land, but there are people who are living there, and these people inhabiting this land are crazy. They're pagans and they're savages, And there's so many things going on there. Women seem to have a voice at the table. There's men dressed like men, women dressed like women. And we need to get over there and help them. And so Spain said, all right, you go over there, you take the army, load them up on your big ship and take the mad rabid dogs with you, get the heck back over there and get us this land. Educate these people on the Holy Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, and the virgins. So Balboa took the army and the mad dogs, hopped back onto his boat, came across the big creek, landed back over on the southern shores of Turtle Island, started to interact with the indigenous group, and then started to influence the men in our group. So they were teaching and persuading our men through a bartering system of giving them different colonial items like guns and blankets and those types of things, and teaching them that violence against women. So they were teaching the men that they needed to be in control, that they needed to be dominant, and that women should have no voice in the community. They also started to teach the community members that men should not dress like women and women should not dress like men. And they encouraged the communities to dig these deep trenches. And in these trenches, they would throw our women who had a voice in our communities. And they would throw our Two-Spirit, our Indigenous queer people, who carried many gifts in our communities. And they would throw the mad dogs in there to rip apart and kill our strong Indigenous relatives and our Two-Spirit people. And so our Two-Spirit people and our strong women started to run from community to community. But we know historically in our communities that Two-Spirit people, Indigenous, queer folks have always been included in our communities. We know that we had special roles and significant roles within our community that helped our community stay healthy, and that we were respected and honored in our communities. One of the most famous of the Two-Spirit Indigenous queer individuals on Turtle Island is Weewa. In this picture, you would see Weewa, and Weewa has a fascinating story. In order for us to be able to use this image, I contacted Weewa's community, the Zuni tribe community, and asked that we might be able to share the story. And they gave us the permission to be able to tell the story as long as it was going to help other Indigenous queer and Indigenous people understand the significance of Two-Spirit people. So I am thankful and always mindful to acknowledge the role that they play in our presentation. Weewa was very talented and very smart, intelligent, and had learned many settler languages and became a messenger between Indigenous groups and would run and tell Indigenous groups of the danger that was coming from the settlers, from the foreigners, from the explorers on Turtle Island. Weewa also quickly learned the settlers' languages. Weewa had many gifts, was a medicine keeper, medicine picker, child caregiver, etc. in the community, and was very well known and respected in not only her own community, but other communities as well. When the settlers and foreigners had realized that Weewa was this magnificently talented, respected individual in the communities, they wanted to show Spain what was possible with the savages and with the pagans here on this new land that they had found for Spain. So they loaded Weewa up onto their big boat, took her over to the leader in Spain, and pranced her around like she was a trophy, and told them that this is what is possible if we lend a strong hand to the savages and pagans and show them that our way is the only way. While Weewa was over in Spain undressing one day, several of the guards had noticed Weewa's genitalia, and quickly Weewa was beaten and bruised, thrown back on a ship, and brought back here to her people. Another one of the early Two-Spirit peoples that we know of is Ishtosh. Ishtosh comes from a coastal community, and again, another well-known, well-respected Two-Spirit individual along the coastal tribes of our relatives in what is now known as the United States. One of the things that have changed for us, I had mentioned, was our clothing. Our traditional clothing often tells a story about who we are, where we come from, what our colors are, what our role or what our responsibilities may be within our communities, our families, and within our nation. And for coastal people, even though we did not have a system of currency as settlers and foreigners had in their nations, in their communities, we often use systems of bartering or use whatever resources we had within our territories to share with other relatives from other territories. So the coastal groups, of course, had everything that was available in terms of resources in the water. And so they often, in their regalia, we would often tell a story about our wealth by showing those different resources that we would have. So Ishtosh here, we have been able to determine is somebody of great wealth in the community because the regalia tells a story by all of the shells that Ishtosh is wearing on the regalia tells us that there is a history of this individual being wealthy in the community, therefore being respected and honored within that community. In this slide, we can see that there is a recognition of all the different genders that are presented and that we know of in Indigenous communities. In most Indigenous communities across Canada and the United States, across Turtle Island, there are as many as anywhere from 13 to 15 different genders within our communities. The gender that we know of now is Eurocentric construct, and it does not take into consideration Two-Spirit people, Indigenous, queer, and Indigenous communities. I see the Eurocentric construct of gender is very narrow. It oppresses us as Two-Spirit people, Indigenous people throughout policies and throughout different protocols and throughout legislation. In this picture, we can see that there are very different genders. So off to the left is one gender seated on the ground. Off to the right seated is another gender. And at the back, we can visibly see that these are representatives and members of the Two-Spirit Indigenous queer community who are present in this picture. Two-Spirit people, we have always had very significant roles and responsibilities in our communities. Anishinaabe the terms that I use, I'm also a very strong advocate that Indigenous, queer, Two-Spirit people find out what the terms are in our communities and employ those terms. Ojokwe in Anishinaabe language roughly translates to wise woman, and the roles and responsibilities behind that include gathering wisdom, knowledge, and bringing it back to our people and sharing that information with our people so that it can be then passed on from generation to generation. But that is also one of the roles and responsibilities that we all share as Indigenous people. And in many of our communities, Two-Spirit people were the individuals who collected medicines for the ceremonies that we do. We were the ones who harvest and we grew those medicines for ceremonies. We were the child caretakers in our communities. We were the hunters, the gatherers, the home builders. We possess the masculine and the feminine ceremonies that are often exist within our communities. I possess the masculine and feminine ceremonies that have been gifted to me throughout my journey as Anishinaabe Ojokwe. We had all of these magnificent roles, but they had been influenced by settler and foreign and Eurocentric constructs. One of probably the most influential, again, changes that had happened for us as Indigenous people, because Eurocentric construct of gender and gender identity is different. Euro construct of family is radically different from ours as well. For instance, in many Indigenous communities, those individuals that we would call our first cousins are actually seen as our siblings. And those individuals that we call auntie or uncle by Eurocentric construct are our additional moms and dads, and so their roles and responsibilities would be different than an auntie and an uncle or a first cousin. And one of the oppressive Eurocentric policies that we have out there is the system and this policy of bereavement that does not take into consideration our first cousins as being our siblings or our aunties and uncles being our additional moms and dads. And when they do not recognize our construct of family, it then oppresses us in the system or the way that we know how to grieve successfully. For instance, in many of the Indigenous and non-Indigenous agencies and organizations that I have become acquainted throughout my journey, there's very limited time given to people known as bereavement leave. And sometime in most cases, it can be only 5 days. And if we think about only 5 days given for bereavement leave for members of our immediate family, then that denies us an opportunity to fulfill our roles and responsibilities to ourselves, our family, our community, and our nation. If we examine the process of condolences that our Haudenosaunee relatives have, that process often is longer than 5 days. For Anishinaabe people, sometimes we have our sacred fires burning longer than 5 days. So these policies and protocols that we employ in many of our agencies and organizations need to change in order for us to be able to successfully grieve and fulfill our roles and responsibilities. I wanted to include this picture to kind of examine where we've come from. When we look at the oppressive nature and the genocidal nature that has been forced on Indigenous people, we have had to suppress many of our ways of being and our ways of life, and that includes certainly our artistic ability. I believe that every one of my relatives, Indigenous people, have very artistic abilities. And in this picture by Kent Monkman, I absolutely love that he's taking this gift of art and has shown how we as Two-Spirit people have been left out of these deciding tables by the settlers, how we were not included in the decision-making that excluded us, and that Two-Spirit people, that we are picking up our bundles in the last 10, 15, 20 years. We're picking up our bundles and we are reclaiming our space within our communities. It's incredibly important that when we look at the calls to action in the final report from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which I have read and which I have gone through, I was sad to see that Two-Spirit people were only remotely mentioned in this document. And sad because I know, as my lived experience as Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, as Two-Spirit, as Indigenous queer, is that if we are not purposely mentioned in these important documents, homophobia shrouds our existence and it still continues. That if our leadership does not continue to mention our existence, or does not continue to acknowledge our existence, we are easily left behind in the dust. And so we have to be mentioned in all of these important documents because our lived experience is extremely and radically different within our communities, whether we are on reserve or off reserve. There are different forms of discrimination that happen to us as Indigenous queer people through policies. For instance, another such document that does not even mention Indigenous queer or Two-Spirit people at all and totally denies our existence through not having done so is the Indian Act. And the Indian Act, of course, is racist and discriminating against all Indigenous people, but by not having even acknowledged us as Two-Spirit people, took us away outside of our community so that we were not included in systems such as housing. So back home in my community, I was discriminated against housing as an Indigenous queer, as a Two-Spirit person, because I would not marry somebody of the opposite gender and I would not produce children. And because I would not do those things, I would not get a home. Some of those systems now have changed in some First Nations communities, but in many Indigenous communities, the resources of housing still discriminates against Two-Spirit people. And the argument used is that for many years had been that we would be considered to be single. Our unions were not recognized. Interestingly enough, about unions is it's only just recently that Indigenous unions were recognized here on Turtle Island, officially recognized by the various levels of government. And we had always believed as Two-Spirit people, the reason that they would not recognize Indigenous unions is because our Indigenous unions have always included two individuals who identify from the same gender. So we were way ahead of Eurocentric constructs in our understanding about everything. Many years ago, I spoke at an International Rainbow Conference, and at the beginning, one of the things that I asked them to not do is force the use of pronouns and nouns on me, because we have our own terms. I find for myself that when groups particularly force nouns and pronouns on me, it's another form of oppression that denies the existence of the Anishinaabe language and other Indigenous languages. Rather, I encourage Indigenous people, find our own terms within our communities, use those terms. So behind the name Nwakagiji Miigwan, I could put Anishinaabe Ojokwe is a means for people to understand that those are the terms that I go by. And we know that within the Canadian Indian residential school system, the Two-Spirit experience was radically different as well. I'm going to let Michael talk about some of the terms that we have, but one of the things I did want to mention with this slide up is I cried when I read the report, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, Trans Identifying and Two-Spirit People report. I cried when I read that report because finally somebody understood our importance, that somebody included us, knowing that if they had not included us, that we would have this heavy shroud of homophobia over us in our communities, and people could easily deny our existence one more time. What I will appreciate, and I do like to mention to folks, is the incredible words spoken by Senator Honorable Murray Sinclair when he delivered one of his speeches connected to the calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliation, where Murray specifically states that it has been known by Indigenous communities across Turtle Island that when Two-Spirit people are present during ceremony, or when Two-Spirit people conduct ceremony, it is believed that those ceremonies are much stronger in power. And that's a very powerful statement to make, particularly when we are still dealing with heavy homophobia within our communities and within our agencies and organizations.
Hi, I'm H.G. Watson with Daily Extra. Over the last several years, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada has been traveling across the country collecting the accounts of First Nation survivors of residential schools. This week in Toronto, they're making their first hearings for people that are two-spirited, who experienced residential schools in a way that was very unique.
My name is Laurie McDonald. I am Neheo. Neheo means people of the four directions. I just come in from Victoria, British Columbia, but I'm originally from the Enoch First Nation in Alberta.
Right. And you're here in Toronto for the next few days to tell your story at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I was wondering why you decided that you wanted to make the journey to tell your story.
I actually did tell my story to the Truth and Reconciliation maybe about, I think it was about 6-7 years ago. And, but in telling your story, we tell our stories as survivors. And as survivors, it's fine because, you know, we talk about what does our story consist of? Our story can consist of, yes, we were abused. Yes, we were physically abused. Yes, we were sexually abused. Yes, we were a product of neglect. But the one thing that was missing in this whole process of the settlement was that they overlooked the fact that we as two-spirited people were unique in a sense. Yes, we had the same abuse system, but when you're a two-spirited person, all too often, you know, if you come from a traditional background and you know who you are, and when you go into these schools, you actually become somebody that's a prey. You're preyed upon, even though you're 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. For me, I come from a background where this was normal for us to be two-spirited people and to have those personalities because we walked into those two worlds. But when you went into this school, what the adjudicators and the commission failed to realize from our perspective is that our abuse was probably much more severe.
What age did you end up going to a residential school?
For me, I was fortunate, and I say fortunate. I went to the Ermineskin Residential School, and I always make this, I would have been about 10 or 11. And the year I was there, I put it in my packsack for so many years, but I brought it out when I made it in comparison. What year did John Kennedy get shot? 1962. So this would have been 1962, 63, I believe. But this is when I would relate to me as being my second year in there. So I would have been about 10.
Right. And how long were you in the school?
I was in the school for 6 years.
Right. I read in a newspaper article in the Victoria Observer, I believe it was, that you felt that you had to go underground when you were in the school. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
It's exactly what I just told you.
Yeah.
When we say we had to go underground, is that because I come from a background, as I said, where for me to walk into world was normalized. Mm-hmm. My family, my parents, my grandmother knew who I was and what my role. It's all about role that is given to you when you're very little. And some people and some First Nation organizations, some First Nation people say it's like they compare it to the bow in a basket, mm-hmm. Meaning that if you, when you're little, if you gravitated to the basket, that was your role, be it what it was. If you gravitated to the bow, that would depict that's what the Creator had picked for you, is to be that hunter, as opposed to being the picker. Mm-hmm. So for me, and I say I come from a traditional background, I had all those tools impacted me, and I was taught that role. But once you went into the school, without trying to be obvious, because obvious, there were feminine traits in me, but for me to say that go underground, I had to hide who I was.
Now I understand that you're an educator and that you've been working as well with First Nations children and other two-spirited children. What role do you think that this commission is playing? Like, do you feel that it's helping to rebuild some of those connections, or what makes it important for you?
Well, I'm looking at the process for the commission and the commissioners and what their mandate was, and they've accomplished what they carried out the agreement that was settled for them, but they hadn't finished yet. Because when I say they haven't finished yet, they hadn't dealt with our particular segment. For me as an educator, and I have right now, I'm an adult instructor for Aboriginal social workers, and part of that process of them is to be educated about the residential school and the effects, and talk about the truth and reconciliation, and to explain to them, yes, reconciliation is part of a big package here. Yes, we've gotten through this level, but for me as a person talking about reconciliation, a little bit. It's got a long way to go yet. And I think it might help for me. Reconciliation might be a little higher now, a little step higher, in the fact that, yes, the commissioner is listening to the Two-Spirit community, because our story is different. Our story is more profound. Our story was more intense, and the abuse and the effects of it was more intense. Right. Now they have to listen to that. They just can't blanket us and put us in one little basket.
I want to thank you so much.
That's a really important video for many different reasons, because if we read between the lines, first we can see and we acknowledge that the experiences of our relatives who identify as Two-Spirit, Indigenous, queer, and residential schools certainly were awful preyed upon. But outside of residential schools, the same thing was happening in our community. In my community, I know that with myself, because I was different, I wanted to do all the things that the boys did, but also wanted to do all the things that the girls did. And that maybe when I was younger, I was a little bit more feminine than some of the other boys, is that it gave justification for the perpetrators to rape me or to sexually assault me. And I can say that confidently because years later, a gentleman who had raped me when I was young came to me to apologize. And those were the words that he spoke, that he felt that it was okay for him to rape me because I was different and I was more feminine. So this particular story that we were just able to witness via Zoom speaks volumes to me about my experience having lived in my community, as well as I'm sure it does for many other Indigenous queer folks out there who are struggling with that past, that part of their history as well.
Here, I think it's just really important, and what I think this really kind of highlights is the importance of kind of why we're here today, because there was this erasure of this experience through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and now we kind of see in the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls inquiry, the report, the calls for justice, they do explicitly include, Two-Spirit and LGBTQIA+, I believe is the acronym they used in the report, that, they are included in these experiences. They are recognized as a particularly vulnerable group within the Indigenous community as well, and that they're part of the reason why we're here today is to ensure that that erasure does not occur again, and that the work goes forward to include these voices, and hopefully more action that comes out of that final report and the calls for justice, that Two-Spirit and queer Indigenous people are included in that and see the benefits of it as well. What we do kind of want to do generally through all this is, we're looking to help, as I mentioned at the beginning, kind of expand kind of like knowledge, provide information, reduce the stigma, so that like moving forward in different workplaces, service providers, communities, that queer and Indigenous, Two-Spirit people can feel welcomed at home, do not hopefully face discrimination, erasure, or other, violent acts in the future. That's ultimately the goal of what we're doing here today. So what we really kind of want to do, and I think is just kind of cover some topics a little bit to kind of help people to just grow more comfortable with these topics and grow their knowledge base, so that, when, perhaps you interact with a member of the queer community, Two-Spirit community, if you're, at your job and you're providing services, so they feel welcomed and are able to access those services, and not, have there be perhaps barriers created that you're not even aware of that might be acting in those things. That's really what we're trying to do here today. So what we like to do is acknowledge language, right? Language is extremely, extremely important. And it's really important to understand how language is being used by different communities to express themselves and their identities. I think that this is generally, and I think you see it a lot here, today in the world, that language causes, it can be a point of frustration, anxiety for quite a few people with the queer community and other communities as well. The hope is, for us, that the increased, perhaps familiarity with some of these terms, the reasons they were created, and why they're important, will maybe prevent situations where someone may feel defensive or uncomfortable when presented with a new concept that they aren't familiar with. And to be honest, we're going to cover very few of what we could cover. There could honestly be essentially a queer dictionary. I'm sure that probably someone has created one of those, but we're just going to cover some of the basics, go into some of the perhaps more topical terms and language that's being used to just try and gain that sense of familiarity. And, I think it's important also to recognize kind of what's happening here, which is that, queer community generally and the Two-Spirit community as well, specifically, are going through processes of actually being able to develop its own language and to define themselves. Until recently, that wasn't possible. Many members of the queer community did not have a voice or were lumped together by outside forces. Kind of, I think generally, Lyndon has talked about the Eurocentric concepts and constructs that have been imposed upon, much of our society until recently, and still certainly in some people's views, queer community members, Two-Spirit community members have essentially been lumped up into categories and demonized as, essentially sinners, deviants, and at times the mentally ill. This is an important thing to recognize, that there's a great project essentially being undertaken right now to define and express these various identities, genders, and gender expressions. Commonly, you'll see, the acronym. The most common, generally one I would say, is probably LGBTQ+. The L generally we'll just cover just very basically lesbian. It generally means a female identifying person who's enduring physical, romantic, and/or emotional attraction is to other women. It's not, some people may not necessarily use the term. Some lesbians may refer to themselves as gay. Gay can be essentially kind of an umbrella term that's used more broadly. So gay, as I mentioned, can be an umbrella term to kind of, refer to just queerness generally. But it's generally kind of referenced to be a person who experiences attraction to people of the same sex and/or gender. Gay can include both male and female identified individuals, as I mentioned. Bisexual is a person who experiences physical, romantic, and/or emotional attraction to people of the same gender and another gender. Attraction to multiple genders can differ in ways and degrees over time, and don't require sexual experience to have occurred. Transgender, this is an umbrella term for those whose gender identity and/or gender expression differs from what is typically associated with the sex that they were assigned at birth. Those who fall under this umbrella term may not actually identify as transgender, and we should use or try and use the term that they prefer. Some transgender people take medically assisted steps like hormones or surgery to bring their bodies into alignment with their gender identity, but not all do or can, and it is not necessary in order for someone to identify as transgender and to be recognized as such. The transgender identity is not dependent on physical appearance or medical procedures. Queer is a term that's been essentially reclaimed. Obviously, it's pretty well known as having been an insult or a slur previously, but it's one of those kind of meant to be more now used commonly as an umbrella term, just generally for, the diversity in sexual orientation and gender identity and expression within, the community at large. It's really kind of been reclaimed in that sense. Not everyone necessarily is on board with that, and certainly we respect that. Certainly from our perspective, I do find it, and the Queer Justice Project obviously has queer in the name, so we have certainly adopted it. So it is one term that we have adopted. So just briefly, obviously Lyndon has talked at length about the Two-Spirit identity, its history, how it incorporates roles and responsibilities beyond queerness. So I have, kind of a definition here a little bit that, I think Lyndon approves of. So it is also an umbrella English term for a person who identifies as having both a masculine and feminine spirit, or a similar concept within the culture and language of Indigenous communities, which were displaced due to the gender binary and homophobia of European colonizers. It affirms the interrelatedness of multiple aspects of identity, including gender, sexuality, community, culture, and spirituality. As Nawaka Giji Migwan explained, Two-Spirit is a term that was created. It's in English, but there are words, in different languages, in different communities that are used. And so we wanted to provide some examples beyond Ojokwe, which Lyndon provided. So here are some examples in the Cree language, Ojibwe, and then a few others here as well, Lakota, Navajo, and Mi'kmaq. So here we have kind of often when you see the plus At the end of the LGBTQ plus, that is meant to encompass many, many other identities, sexual orientations, gender identities and expressions. So these are some of the ones that you'll still kind of see. Some organizations have longer acronyms. So the one that the Queer Justice Project, for example, uses is LGBTQIAPGNC. So the I generally stands for intersex, which is an umbrella term describing people born with reproductive or sexual anatomy and or chromosome patterns that can't be classified as typically male or female. Asexual is a term for people who do not experience sexual attraction. There is also some differentiation in some of these terms where there's a difference between sexuality and emotional attachment. So for each of them, bisexuality, asexuality, there are like kind of partner terms that associate more emotional attachment. So aromantic is to say that a person does not experience romantic attraction, or biromantic would be someone who maybe not sexually but emotionally feels attachments to both there's the same gender or the opposite gender and another gender. There is that distinguish as well. Pansexual is a term that is as I said before, these concepts are evolving, they're being created. Pansexual is certainly gaining in prominence recently. It is kind of the partner almost term to bisexuality. So many people have raised concerns about the term bisexuality because of the prefix at the beginning there, bi, which many people criticize as potentially implying that there are only two genders, that it supposes essentially the gender binary. So pansexuality has gained in prominence quite a bit because as a move away kind of from bisexuality as a term to kind of encompass that people can be sexually attracted to all genders and not just having that prefix that some people do not agree with. There are still many people who do identify as bisexual. I personally do as well. I've never considered bisexuality to exclude other genders. So that's just kind of, it's up to, I do certainly recognize people's concerns with that term. So I wanted to let everyone know kind of that point of contention. So gender nonconforming, that's the GNC in our acronym. So it's also a broad term referring to people who do not behave in a way that conform to the traditional expectations of their gender, or whose gender expression does not fit neatly into any one category. Kind of similar in many ways to non-binary, which is a gender identity where the person does not identify as exclusively male or female and may identify as both, somewhere in between, or neither. So it's a very kind of broad term and broad gender identity that rejects essentially the binary. And then the Q. So I did previously put Q as queer, but the Q in these acronyms can also mean questioning. So questioning is also a term kind of used that reflects the process that someone might go through when they are unsure about or exploring kind of their own sexual orientation and or gender identity. So there, as I mentioned, there can be quite a few of terms. There could be a whole dictionary, as I mentioned, but I do want to kind of just mainly cover some of the main ones. So sex, there's a lot of arguments and perhaps misunderstandings about what the difference is between sex and gender. So sex is the classification of someone as either male or female that is assigned at birth based only on the appearance of external anatomy. Sex, in reality, you'll often hear people say, sex is biological, right? There can't be different, or they'll conflate gender and sex, say there can't be multiple genders because sex is biological, so it must be male or female. Well, the reality is that that's really not a very convincing argument, as many medical professionals will tell you. Sex is generally actually a combination of bodily characteristics like chromosomes, hormones, internal and external reproductive organs, and secondary sex characteristics, all of which can not specifically, if further explored, wouldn't necessarily lead to a designation of either male or female. Gender, on the other hand, is, some people I think criticize this or laugh at this, but it is in fact, a social construct. It's a classification of people, often based on their assigned sex at birth as either male or female, but it takes a form, within that person as a set of social, psychological, and emotional traits. When someone is cisgender, a person whose gender identity, which means the gender that they personally identify with internally, corresponds to the social expectations associated with the sex that was assigned to them at birth. So essentially, it's just like when someone identifies with the sex that they were assigned, designated. As I mentioned, I've used, and I'm going to be going back and forth because a lot of these terms overlap quite a bit. So the gender binary, I've used that a few times. But it's generally the idea that there are only two genders and that every person is only one or one of those two, essentially, either male or female. That's what is, the concept that's being very much challenged and, I think quite successfully these days, that, that's an outdated concept. So what evolved from that is, people now look at gender beyond the binary and see it more as a spectrum. And that's only one concept, but the spectrum generally is kind of the more basic expansion of the idea or outside of the gender binary. So it looks at the idea of there being a range of experience along a continuum between 2 points on opposite ends. And it can be not just related to sex and gender, but it can also be related to sexuality as well. But, in this case, if we're talking about gender, it would be like male, female, and then, a range and spectrum of different experiences and genders. As I mentioned, the spectrum is a concept that kind of came out and has been developed, but it is also being criticized itself. So others don't agree that the spectrum is the best representation of gender because it still uses as reference points both male and female on the opposite ends, and therefore is limiting in that way. So and then we're getting a little bit into like queer theory here, but so I won't go very much into it, but just as an example of another concept that has been, introduced is kind of like gender almost as a cloud, where there are, different points within this cloud that are different genders, and two of which are male and female, but they're not necessarily related to each other or in any way related to the others. They're just points of existence. And all these different genders are equal and valid and not necessarily relational. To understand kind of gender identity a little bit, so gender identity is a person's internal, deeply held sense of their own gender. It can be male, female, or something else. And so gender expression, on the other hand, is how someone externally expresses what their internal gender identity is. It's expressed in many, many different ways. Basically, everything about our existence is gendered, kind of how we've been socialized, person's name, their pronouns, their clothing, their haircut, their behavior, their voice, body characteristics, everything essentially about us is often gendered in some way. The way that this can, be expressed, often, if you want to use descriptors for it, you would describe it usually as being masculine, feminine, neither, both, or a non-binary, other options as well. So we just wanted to kind of go over some of those terms because those are ones that, do believe that there is quite a bit of confusion over often, mixing up of terms, but those are kind of some of the concepts behind it. And hopefully, I hope that clarifies, at least for some people, a little bit kind of what some of these terms mean. One thing I did want to mention as well, I did mention it earlier as well, I think when I was providing kind of the definition of transgender, is, the idea of, transitioning. Many people have in their mind, when you hear that or think of that, surgery or other medical procedures. That's really not what transitioning is as a concept, or at least it's much broader than that. This is not, again, a requirement for people who are transgender to go through. A person is transgender, when the gender identity, again, the definition is that it's when their gender identity and or expression is different from the one that was assigned at birth. That is all that's required for someone to identify with and ought to be recognized as being transgender. So surgery and other medical assistance, such as hormones, are only one example of a way that a person can transition. Other ones, include socially. One of the terms in here is coming out. So, letting a lot of people also, though, now are actually moving beyond kind of the concept of coming out into, inviting people in, because, people are wanting to kind of move away from that and look at it as a different way of, letting people in to see who your true self is, as opposed to the coming out process, which has kind of been, often defined with depictions of, closets and other things. So socially, transitioning is, of course, letting family, friends know, changing pronouns, and then moving forward into legal transition. Part of what the Queer Justice Project does is that we have a program, a trans ID clinic, where we help provide advice and peer support for members of the trans community who are looking to change their identification. So changing their names, changing their sex designations on different pieces of ID, so that it reflects their gender identities. Often IDs are a source of anxiety for many members of the trans community. So it's also something to keep in mind, as service providers, as community members, that these things are sometimes active processes by which people can be outed. It can expose them to harm, violence, and certainly that's something that the trans community is very aware of. And so trans ID clinics and other initiatives like this are very important, and they're certainly growing in prominence. I certainly enjoy seeing that, and I've actually been helping others, start up around Ontario. So it's very, very exciting to see that happening. And of course, the other way of transitioning is, it can be changing gender expression, other ways. So just wanted to kind of clarify that, transitioning is a process. It's a very personal process. There's no one way to define it. And there shouldn't be, expectations of, where people are at, how they're doing it, other things like that. It's a very personal process, and it's about how someone identifies and how they choose to enact that within their own lives. So we did want to just touch very briefly, because it's, as of January 7th, I believe it was, conversion therapy is actually now illegal here in Canada. What it is essentially, for those who may not know, is that it is a pseudoscience therapy primarily used by religious organizations that seeks to remove a person's feelings of same-sex attraction or change feelings of gender dysphoria. So feeling that their gender does not reflect their gender identity, or their sex that was assigned to them does not reflect their gender identity. There is no evidence that this process works. It is considered to have no scientific or medical merit, as well as to be entirely unethical. Instead, it is often found to be harmful and cause those who are subjected to it to experience increased anxiety, self-harm, including and up to suicide, depression, and low self-esteem. As I mentioned, as of January 7th, it is now officially illegal in Canada. So it's just this month, in the year 2022. But it does not mean, obviously, that this will not still happen. It just means that, it is now a criminal offense to engage in this activity. So we wanted to highlight that because it is also, it is very much a form of violence against the queer community, all members of the queer community, certainly who have gone through it. But there's, I think, a lot of parallels, in this aspect, just generally with the queer community and the Indigenous community, as a very, very violent form of an assimilationist kind of institution and policy that has been enacted and caused, severe harm to many members of the community abroad. So it is very much was meant to be a process to destroy a very intrinsic aspect of someone's identity. There's many issues still facing the queer community, but there's also still progress being made. And it's good to see that has officially become a law now, as of this month. So at the beginning, I did mention that, part of what we're trying to do through this is to kind of challenge, provide information, challenge kind of norms that maybe, might be causing internal or kind of subtle instances where, queer community members, two-spirit community members may not be feeling welcomed or included, or, maybe creating barriers to them. So this kind of form of cultural or societal kind of biases that may not be explicit, and it may not be intentional. We often refer to those as, heteronormativity and cisnormativity, which just means that, it's the assumption just generally within our society to assume essentially that everyone is either heterosexual or cisgendered by default, right? And that's kind of our approach to everything. Only once someone comes out to us do we kind of change our behavior. Heteronormativity and cisnormativity, they're these, cultural and societal biases that are often unconscious, that privileges, hetero and cis identities and norms, while ignoring trans and queer identities by just assuming all people are, either cis or straight by default. The opposite and kind of more extreme aspects of those are heterosexism and cissexism, which, are kind of those more active prejudice and discrimination, active almost hate kind of held within people, and that is expressed towards members of the queer community. Obviously, sometimes, obviously heterosexism, cissexism are horrible, but, sometimes just as negative can be kind of those subtle underlying aspects of our society that, slowly kind of ebb away at people's ability to fully participate. So certainly challenging kind of just those norms, those normativities that our society still kind of has is something that we are looking to do in the future and, continuing. We did just want to mention, because we're going to get into it in a bit, kind of like more active suggestions on what can happen, what organizations, what workplaces, what communities can do. But kind of what is an ally? Generally it's a person who is a member of a dominant group. In this case, generally either straight or cisgender. Although those people can certainly have, marginalized intersecting identities. So it's not just that they're straight and cisgender. But in this case, an ally would be someone from, a dominant group being cis or straight, who works to end oppression in their own personal and professional life by supporting, respecting, and advocating for the queer or other marginalized communities. So that's really kind of what we're looking for to help, hopefully people become allies and even perhaps advocates for the queer community in the future. And I think one last thing I did want to kind of raise, because I do think it's a very important term, and I mentioned it briefly, is the idea of coming out or, letting people in, because I think this is one of those concepts that's expressed and it's shown in the media kind of in a bit of a deceptive way, I guess, kind of not deceitful, but deceptive way, because it's kind of, I think, often portrayed as being this single moment in a person's life where, they have this realization almost, right? And then they go and they like yell it from the rooftops to their friends and family and everyone that's important to them. And then it's over, right? And then they're just a member of the queer community, and that's kind of the coming out story, right? But in reality, that's kind of a glorification of it. Coming out is a lifelong process, and it's one of self-acceptance and then sharing your true identity with others. For many people, it happens every single day. Myself and Lyndon did it today with all of you just by making this presentation and introducing ourselves. Some people don't have the option necessarily to actually express it, right? Idea of passing, some people can't pass necessarily as not being a member of the queer community. So when they are, just by being themselves in public, at their job, at school, in their community, whatever it is, that's an active process for them potentially of, coming out or letting people in. And it's also a process that can often lead to or put them at risk of violence or discrimination or whatever it is. And those are still very, very real risks and issues that are faced by the queer community, the Two-Spirit community. And, that's why we still have inclusion of our communities in reports like the Murder and Missing Indigenous Women and Two-Spirit LGBTQ QIA report. So I just wanted to highlight that because, coming out and just being yourself can be dangerous. It can cause people's employment and income to become precarious. It can threaten relationships with friends and family. It can be seen to clash with, other aspects of a person's identity, like their culture or their religion. all those kinds of things. So it's not just that one moment. It's very much one of those things that's persistent, and it can be an amazing thing, but it can also be a risky thing. This is something that is also one of those topical issues. It gets a lot of pushback. I think there's a lot of confusion around it. So just the definition for now, and then we'll get into it more later. But preferred gender pronouns, they're often used in introductions, when first meeting someone. It's becoming more common, kind of standard practice for a lot of organizations. But there is obviously resistance to it, and some objections to it. Often kind of examples, the main ones are he, him, his, she, her, hers, they, them, theirs. But there are also like other gender neutral pronouns that are created that have been developed. You kind of probably won't see them as often, but certainly if someone introduces themselves and presents pronouns that you're not familiar with, I suggest it's certainly okay, and you don't have to worry about asking them what their pronouns are. If you didn't catch exactly how to pronounce them, ask them that, because I'm sure that they would appreciate it to get them right. So that's just kind of what they are. They're ways to essentially refer to someone in the third person. So we did have generally a couple of videos that we would show on this, but I'm going to skip this one. But I'm going to go to the pronoun video. So normally what's important about these videos, and I encourage people to maybe go and look at it on YouTube, it's on YouTube, is because, as I mentioned at the beginning, Lyndon and I have very specific identities. So part of what we do is try and include some videos in our presentation from people from other communities, so you can hear from them specifically and their experiences, why this is important to them, and it's not just coming from us. So this is a very good, it just kind of introductory video to kind of, the trans identity and what that means. So I would certainly encourage people to go take a look at it. It's a very good video. But I do want to show this one because I think it's, perhaps more relevant for, implementing in workplaces, communities, all those kinds of things.
Oh my God, okay.
So I have to go with that one.
What a break.
Okay, I don't.
Pronouns are basically words used to refer to a person rather than their name.
They, she, and he are all examples of common pronouns.
He and she are gendered pronouns.
She's typically used by people who identify as female, and he's typically used by people who identify as male.
However, he or she pronouns are sometimes used by people who don't identify as strictly male or female.
Some people prefer gender-neutral pronouns.
Gender-neutral pronouns are generally used by people who identify as genderqueer or non-binary.
A few common gender-neutral pronouns are they, ze, and a, but there are a whole array of gender-neutral pronouns.
People think long and hard about the pronouns they'd like to use and why.
If you use the wrong pronoun for someone, that's what's called misgendering.
When a person has new pronouns, it can take a bit of getting used to, but it's really important to use the right ones.
A person's identity is very important, and it's super important to respect that.
So when people use the wrong pronoun to me, I find that I've gone through all this effort to kind of come out and be myself, and it's kind of just thrown back in my face. Coming out for me was mainly awkward with a lot of people that used to know me. People didn't understand. I think there is a lot of misunderstanding. When people get my pronouns right, it makes me feel like I'm, like being myself, and people are responding to that and just like respecting me as a person.
When people get my pronouns right, I feel respected by them, and I end up feeling a lot more comfortable around them.
Sometimes if you identify someone with a different pronoun that they don't identify as, you can potentially actually upset them. And I don't think you should be upsetting someone in this process. And that's why I think it's very important to know what someone identifies themselves as and respect it.
It's not about like you're a terrible person if you mess up, or you're a terrible person if you take time to adjust. It's totally not. But it's more about making that extra effort for someone that you do care about, or just kind of being a bit considerate that everyone has different needs. And, it's just a really cool thing to do for a person. And I think it's easy to not quite get that, or just see it as, there's a person who's mad at you, and outwardly they might be a little bit upset, but inwardly what they're feeling that's motivating that reaction is so much more an understanding that they're not hating on you. It's just that they really are probably a bit fed up and a bit hurt.
It's not always easy to come out and tell people that you're trans. Never assume someone's pronouns. Just ask if you're not sure. Using the correct pronouns is a pretty big deal, and it's a really awesome thing to do.
Genitals don't equal gender.
This is probably the biggest mistake people make. It's a pretty easy assumption to make, but genitals and body don't actually reflect anything about a person's gender at all.
Above all else, don't try and argue with this person, whether you personally agree or not. A person who's asking you to use those pronouns likely has put a lot of thought into it and trust you.
Basically, what's more important? Someone's anatomy or who they really are and their happiness?
Sometimes, however, you will slip up and use the wrong pronouns. It's not good, but it does happen.
Getting used to someone's new pronoun can take time.
And you may feel pretty awkward or even guilty when you make a mistake.
Some may sound pretty strange at first, and changing the words you use in general can be harder than expected.
If you do slip up accidentally, it's important to not lash out at the person or blame them.
You might not pick it up instantly, and it's important to try hard on this. But if you do slip up, don't snap on it.
Just keep trying your best and you'll get the hang of it with time.
Don't freak out. Just make a quick apology, correct yourself, and keep going with the conversation.
Making a big deal out of it, it's probably going to make them feel bad and make the situation very uncomfortable for both of you.
If you hear someone deliberately or even accidentally using the wrong pronouns for a person, don't hesitate to pull them up on it and politely correct them.
Hopefully that helps to explain pronouns a little bit better and lets you know how much it can mean to a person. And it's super important to get them right as much as possible.
Something as small as a tiny word like that could have a huge impact on a gender diverse person.
Both how they feel at the moment and how they feel in the long term.
Having good, accepting, awesome, and loving people around you can really be life-changing.
That's a good video on pronouns. It gives a good kind of introduction. I think someone asked in the chat kind of why some people might be resistant to it. And I think there's two components to this issue. There's respecting other people's pronouns, and then there's also disclosing your own. The two components, essentially the use of pronouns. I think a lot of the objections for respecting other people's, I think comes from that anxiety that I kind of spoke to a little bit about language and the fear of, not getting it right, being, labeled as being homophobic, transphobic, or just disrespectful. It can be, a reaction or counter reaction to people's, beliefs about, the evils of political correctness, those kinds of things, and I think all of that is kind of, I think, background noise to the real issue. When you're talking about respecting other people's pronouns, it's really fundamentally about that, right? It's about respect. That's really all that it's about. I kind of think about it a little bit kind of, and this is like an exaggerated example, and it's not meant to kind of insult anyone for sure, but I think of people who object to respecting other people's pronouns. And I think of kind of like the most kind of ardent, Trump supporter with like the MAGA hat and like the Confederate flag, hopefully not, or something like that. And kind of what their reaction and, likely, a man, I would assume as well, what their reaction is to if I were to go up to them and say, or start calling him ma'am, or refer to him as she, or whatever it is, right? So there's these objections and these concerns about political correctness, concerns about making a mistake. But, misgendering isn't only a queer community issue. Generally, people don't react well. I don't think that person's reaction would be positive. I think it would potentially be violent if I were to misgender him. It's really fundamentally about respect, no matter who the person is. So if someone discloses to you, if they have on their, their Zoom name that they use the pronouns he, him, if they disclose that and announce kind of what their pronouns are at the beginning of an interaction, it's fundamentally that same issue of respect, no matter who the person is, because it's being misgendered is a serious thing that everyone takes seriously. I think some people don't. People who are non-binary may not care. They may use multiple pronouns. They may use he, she, them, right? That they are fine whichever one is used. That is not something you can assume again. So where it's disclosed, certainly, I think it's a matter of respect to use those to the best of your ability. Again, I think there's that anxiety about making mistakes. I still make mistakes. As I mentioned, we do the Trans ID clinic. I try to be as respectful and remember at all times, which pronouns everyone uses, but I still make mistakes and it's awkward. And again, I think the advice in this video is very accurate. It's very much about not making a big deal about it. It's about correcting yourself, but just apologizing quickly and then just moving on with the conversation, because making a big deal of it just makes it more awkward and it makes it more of a thing. That's, I think, kind of like a big part of it. I don't think there's much contention other than that, the fear of making a mistake or just kind of the political reaction to it about respecting other people's pronouns. I think, and Lyndon, maybe you want to address kind of what your position is kind of on pronouns. I think you addressed it a little bit earlier as well.
So what we're talking about with nouns and pronouns here is what I have experienced and what I have heard from a number of Indigenous people is reflections of our languages. First, what I've mentioned before is that Indigenous people, we have our own terms. We have our own terms and phrases to help describe who we are. And being forced to, by either their agencies or other groups or entities, to subscribe to nouns and pronouns is an attempt to not take our own languages seriously. And I've heard many Indigenous people talk about our languages are not based on pronouns and nouns, although they may be inexistent in our languages. Rather, our languages are descriptive. So they're verb and action based, they're adjective based. And because our languages describe who we are, the things that we do, just very descriptive in nature. And so individuals are really advocating, I'm an advocate for Indigenous people to learn our terms, learn our languages that are near extinction, and enforce and encourage the use of our terms that we have that help identify Two-Spirit, our gender identity within our communities, because we're not only then reclaiming our spaces, but we're also reclaiming our languages, which is extremely important. One of the other things, and now I'm going to skip way back to conversation we just had, and all of this stuff that Michael has brought forward is so extremely important for us because our communities, the face of our communities are changing. And we are seeing that many of our young people are subscribing to nouns and pronouns and to all these different identities that Michael has gone through and much more. And I believe as well that because they're not learning about our terms, they're not learning about our descriptions, our ways of being, as we describe Indigenous, queer, and Two-Spirit people using our languages. So perhaps one of the things that we could all walk away from doing here is that when we're working with Indigenous youth and in our communities, let's help them discover our research and find out what their terms are. Let's help them find somebody who can provide safer space for them in their communities, who might be able to lead them and point them in the right direction. Let's point them to the language and knowledge keepers who know these things and know the terms and know the phrases that help describe who we are as Indigenous queer. It's extremely important in order to understand those roles and responsibilities. Now I want to jump way back to what I call the gay acronym, or the queer acronym, the LGBTQ plus, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Across Turtle Island, we have a very significantly strong movement of Two-Spirit people in all of our communities who are advocates to separate from that queer alphabet, from that gay acronym, for many different reasons. That it should be Two-Spirit and LGBTQIAGPNC with no plus at the end. And I'm going to try to help explain that. First, on Turtle Island, our experiences, our lived experiences, are significantly different. And we cannot any longer take the chance of not being listened to. So if we do not stand separate in the acronym, then our fear is that our voices are not heard one more time. Also, that we are the only nation under that acronym that lives under racist discriminatory legislation known as the Indian Act. There's no other nation under that acronym that is oppressed further, even today, by such a piece of legislation. Our experiences are different. Our way of being is different. And for that reason alone, we must remain separate. Because we come from marginalized and oppressed groups that have had forms of genocide forced on us, it would feel hypocritical for Two-Spirit people to participate in an acronym where a large group of numerous groups of people are represented by a plus sign. We as Two-Spirit people know what it feels like to be not represented or to have our voices silent. So we do not want to be seen as a group or a nation that further marginalizes or oppresses any group. So we believe that if we are going to participate in a queer or a gay alphabet, that each group should be represented minus, with a letter, minus the plus sign. Also, that our terms, Indigenous terms, describe who we are, what our roles and responsibilities are, and our roles and responsibilities, our terms speak to those roles and responsibilities. Other members under the Queer Nation, under the acronym, don't have those specifics. So our existence does not depend on or is not dictated to by who we sleep with. Rather, it's all about our roles and responsibilities. And one of the major differences and significant factors as to why Two-Spirit must be separate from that gay queer acronym is, while other members of our sister brotherhood, our nationhood, as folks call it, under the Queer Nation, are looking to create safer space, that's not what we're doing as Two-Spirit people, as Indigenous queer people. We are reclaiming our space. We have always been part of the circle, and we have picked up our bundles, and we are reclaiming our spaces within our community. So for those reasons and many more, that's why everybody is starting to see in the past 5 to 10 years a separation. So it doesn't mean that there's a physical separation from the queer group. We're still part of the queer group and supporting all of our brothers and sisters and trans identify and other individuals underneath that acronym. We're still part of the larger Queer Nation. It's just we need people to understand that we're currently still fighting against systems of genocide. And for those reasons, our lived experiences are different. We also have in our community, for the first time, just within the last couple of years, we have human rights in First Nations communities now. We have not had that kind of privilege in our communities before on reserve. And I encourage all people to challenge our human rights within our communities. I do it. I'm constantly questioning. And I don't accept any form of homophobia. Homophobia is not traditional for Indigenous people. Everybody had a voice and everybody had a space, a safer space in our communities. So I'm a strong advocate to challenge any form of homophobia in no matter what way it presents itself. So for instance, back home or in other communities, when I have been confronted with homophobia from individuals who have labeled themselves as elders or wisdom keepers or knowledge keepers, and they push their homophobia on me, I'm quick to ask them where that comes from and why they want to exclude me from the circle. And I make it very clear that I will never accept an answer such as, that's just the way it's always been. No, it's not. That's not the way it's just ever been. We have been part of this circle and we are back picking up our bundles and we are reclaiming our space. One of the things I wanted to mention about why I do the work that I do is Anishinaabe Ojokwe. I sit at the table, Sisters in Spirit table, so I've been pushing for an inquiry and these calls for justice for over 15 years. One morning I stepped out my door and it bothered me when I was looking at the increase in numbers of Indigenous women, girls, trans-identifying two-spirit people who were going missing or who were being murdered in our communities right across Turtle Island, that if a relative from BC who went missing or was found murdered or was found dead, and I had never met them before, it bothered me and it hurt me. And I remember walking out the door one day and feeling that there was much work for me to do to assist in this crazy climate where I hated feeling that any one of my sisters should feel that they were part of a disposable population. And so I decided I needed to do something. So the first thing I did was I hopped on board and reached out to the local Sisters in Spirit committee and got active, pushing for the inquiry. And then when the inquiry came up in the calls to justice service, of course, I talked about how I cried because two-spirit people are so prevalent throughout that whole massive document. But I realized there's still a lot of work to do. And that's helping not just Canadians, but our own people, our own relatives understand what those calls to justice mean and the enormity of work that we have yet to do. The work that we have to do to include Indigenous women, girl, trans-identifying two-spirit people at all of our tables so that their voices can be heard, because without their perspective, we're never going to be a healthy community again, that they have gifts and they have roles and responsibilities that are important for us to be able to move forward. So that's why I engaged in this lifelong process of pushing and continuing to push to have answers to all these questions that we have. And we have to challenge homophobia. We have to challenge individuals. I had once heard many, many years ago in a conference in BC that, well, while our little Indian kids were in residential schools learning that they were worthless and that they were never going to amount to anything, and that they needed to assimilate and be non-Indigenous people and to shed any way whatsoever of life that was related to Indigenous way of being or Indigenous way of life, they needed to get rid of that. Outside of Canadian Indian residential schools, we have generations of non-Indigenous people who were being educated to learn the same thing about who we are as Indigenous people, that we are worthless, we're savages, we're pagans, and that we would never amount to anything. Well, here we are in 2022, and we're educating Canadians now on their true shared history with Indigenous people. But we still have generations of people who are carrying those forms of racism and discrimination, those beliefs about Indigenous people. But we also have and with those forms of discrimination and racism also comes forms of homophobia. And so we have all these generations of people who are now my age and older who still carry some of those beliefs that they were educated through school. The younger generation now, that's where our hope is, because it's the younger generation who are learning that's not so. All those things that their parents and grandparents had learned about Indigenous people, it's not true. And they're starting to see the magnificent contributions that we have given to the existence and the creation on our own territories, and the contributions that we can continue to make this as an incredible world. When I spoke at a international rainbow conference years ago, my opening comments were, please don't push your way of being on me, and I won't push it on you either, but rather we could educate each other. So they talked about all the challenges that Two-Spirit people and Indigenous queer and the queer nation was facing across the globe. My closing comments were very simple. Had you all listened to Indigenous people in the first place, we wouldn't have had to have these conferences because we were always part of our communities. And there was no discrimination and there was no racism. Everybody had a valid voice and nobody was silenced. All of these things all this enormous change that we're seeing in our community are really good changes, but we have to keep working towards eliminating homophobia in our community because it still shrouds our community. And it is because of Jody Wilson-Raybould that we are seeing human rights within our community today, that we are seeing an avenue legally where we can challenge the homophobia in our communities that we never had before.
Just to finish on the pronouns topic, I just want to emphasize that, displaying your own pronouns is fundamentally an act of solidarity with individuals who are trans, gender diverse, any of those who, identify with a gender that is not, male, female, or are transgendered. Essentially ensuring that, those members of that community aren't singled out, that they're not the only ones, displaying their pronouns to make sure people are getting it right. I don't identify as a member of the trans community, but I display my pronouns because I think it's important to do, and it's in solidarity with that community. I don't, as, Lyndon, I think, expressed kind of his position. I don't think displaying your pronouns should be mandatory. I think it is a voluntary thing. I think people have, there are some concerns about it. Some people, and I think I've tried to emphasize this in the definitions and everything, but there is no correlation between, gender identity and sexual orientation. People can be transgender and either gay or straight, all those kinds of things. So by displaying, say, like for myself, he, him, that doesn't fundamentally identify me as, bisexual, right? That says nothing about my sexuality. If that's the concern that someone has, it's really just an act of solidarity. It's indicating what pronouns you prefer people to use that relate to a gender or gender identity. There are many issues. I think some people see queer community as having, got marriage equality. Now we just got conversion therapy is criminalized, all those kinds of things that, things are going well. I think we're kind of, in some respects, a bit of that model kind of vulnerable or marginalized community, but there are still many, many, many issues that face the queer community, in different levels, different systems that still, expose queer community members to hate, to violence, to discrimination, different systems that still oppress and exclude or have, bias inherently written within their systems. So I just want to put this up here. I don't have time to go through all of them, but there are, many statistics that show this. We're here for the murdered and missing Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit and LGBTQ QIA. So, queer community members, including Two-Spirit people, face many issues, also many, instances of violence. Sexual orientation and, gender identity are high rates for, hate crimes, those kinds of things. Queer community members face issues of, poverty, of homelessness, for being excluded from their communities, their families, addictions issues from different, traumas that are experienced through our community. There's still lots of work to do within Canada as well to fully accept queer communities. Surveys show that, still there's a lot of issues about acceptance within Canada as a whole. I think a lot of people have this idea of queer communities and acceptance of it. But, in instances like, say, if, you see queer acts of affection or public displays of affection, suddenly, when it's in your face, there's less comfort there. What happens if it's your child who's queer or trans identifying? Those kinds of issues, I think, are still prevalent, and it still makes it, difficult, even though there is a certain level of acceptance today, still very difficult for queer community members to exist and to thrive. Did want to go through, I don't think we're going to get to it, in depth more what an ally is. And here's just some steps that we provide to people for workplaces, for organizations, for communities, just some suggestions for things that can be done to try and make spaces more inclusive for queer community members, Two-Spirit community members. And very important is to, try and do some of this work before you advertise yourself as a positive space or a safe space for queer community members. Because if you advertise yourself as that, and then that's not the experience they have, that can be a very significant breach of trust that's hard to regain.
I just wanted to add that the murdered and missing, the calls to justice always speak to each, and that we have a responsibility for each and one of us, every one of us, to be able to find our voice and use our voice. When we hear examples of racism, discrimination, or verbal violence against Indigenous women, girls, trans identifying, Two-Spirit people, stop it in its tracks. We find our voice to be able to stop that. And I'm also seeing the number of people in chat commenting about Pride. I helped coordinate one of the first Indigenous prides in a Indigenous community, and that was Six Nations. And We were really scared about what might happen on that day, but all in all, what happened was we had hundreds of wonderful allies from the community and other communities show up to support Indigenous queer folks. So absolutely, please be supportive in our communities, help organize an Indigenous Queer Two-Spirit Pride. And thank you, everybody, for all the work that you're doing to be allies. By just showing up here today, you're showing me that you're a strong ally for Indigenous Queer and Two-Spirit people, and you absolutely warmed my heart. Thank you.
Nyala, Michael, and Lyndon for the informative presentation.